Hello, good evening, everyone. This is Vanessa with the Historical Society of Frankfurt. Pardon my hair. Anyways, so tonight we have a lecture that I'm really excited about, and it is on the history of the Frankfurt L. Author Harry Garforth has written a book and done a lot of research at the Historical Society to make this happen. His book is for sale or can be gifted for a donation from our website and also in person. As usual, just leave comments if you have them. We will get to them at the end. I can transmit them to the live lecture, and we'll get chatting. So I'm super excited, and here we go. Here's an introduction with our history chair and board member John Buffington.
I'm the program chair of the Historical Society of Frankfurt. This is the regularly scheduled November meeting of 2022 of the Society. We're glad to be seeing a crowd approximating what we were used to before the pandemic live here. Plus, now we have an audience scheduled or scattered all over the country because we now broadcast on YouTube and Facebook. We do this 8 times a year, second Tuesday of the month in the not too cold and not too hot months. So we'll be doing this again next month. Our scheduled program for next month has had to be delayed, so we're not quite sure just at the moment what we're going to do in November. In December, sorry, yeah. In December. Then we'll take the break in January and February, and in March, we'll be back on second Tuesday. Please stick with us for all of this. Whatever it is that's going to be in December, we're going to have a pretty good surprise, I'm pretty sure. Now, tonight, we're going to celebrate the centennial of Frankfurt L, excuse me, and recognize some of the previous history of rail transport here in Frankfurt. We did have a program on that subject previously with the what were they called?
The steam dummies.
Steam dummies, yes.
Thank you.
If you're interested in the subject of rail transport, you might want to look back at that one as well as this one. These things all stay up forever, unless, of course, we're embarrassed and we take them down. But that hasn't happened yet. So we're on a whole new roll since the pandemic started, putting this stuff up and keeping it up forever as an archive of Frankfurt history that's easily accessible from anywhere you are in the country. Now, tonight, as I say, the subject is the centennial of the L. Harry Garforth is going to give me a minute, please, to commend my colleagues for a big transition we made in the last couple of months. We turned a huge corner, moral corner in the society. What we've done in the past since 1905 when we were organized is collect and talk about the history of Frankfurt that we knew about, that people who were associated with us knew about. We weren't deliberately pushing to do a comprehensive program of recording all of the history of Frankfurt all the way back to the 17th century when Frankfurt was first founded as a location occupied by Europeans, let alone let alone for the hundreds and perhaps thousands of years that the area was occupied by the Lenape. Prior to that, we have done very little in the past about the Lenape. So just recently, we decided to take the Lenape, let's see now, that's the Pennsylvania, Lenape tribe of Pennsylvania, Lenape
Nation.
Lenape
Nation.
Lenape Nation of Pennsylvania. There we go. Thank you, Frank. Lenape Nation of Pennsylvania invited us to engage with them. Invited us very politely. They didn't beleaguer us in any fashion. They just said politely, "Would you like to engage with us?" Which we are going to now do. We signed a treaty with them, which is the Treaty of the Treaty of Renewed
Friendship.
Treaty of Renewed Friendship. Thank you, Frank. And that means that we have engaged to do more about incorporating their stuff into our stuff. Meaning you'll be seeing a lecture here eventually on Lenape history. But the first thing is we adopted now, so item number two that we already accomplished, we adopted language for what's called a land acknowledgement. You'll see that soon on our website and elsewhere, acknowledging that we appreciate the fact that we live now where they used to be, and we're going to do what we can to help them to preserve the memory of that long history that they had. So with that said, we'll talk now about the history of the L, the portion of the L that was built in 1921-22 to finish it off so that Frankfort was connected, and the prior history through here of the other rail methods. And we appreciate that Harry Garforth is here. Thank you for coming. And we're delighted to see you. We're looking forward to your chat.
Well, thank you, John. Good evening, everybody. I hope everybody had a chance to get their ballots in today. Vote. I always try to vote in every election because it's so important. Before we get started tonight, I just wanted to inform everybody that we have a book for sale. I am not going to be able to cover the subject matter in as much depth as the book was able to. I will be touching on a lot of things here, but the book is here. We have it for sale, and if you're interested, you can pick up a copy after the presentation. So we're here tonight to talk about the Frankfort Elevated Railway and its predecessors. That's the key part, because we're going to start earlier than 1922. Before I get started, I just wanted to express sincere appreciation to the Historic Society of Frankfort for all their help in both this project, getting the presentation together, and the book. They shared their extensive collection of images with me in the preparation of the work, and if I had any questions, they were quick to respond. So thank you all very much. So as John stated, we're going to be talking about the Market Frankfort line, but actually the Frankfort section of the line that was constructed in 1922. The earlier section was built, as I will go into detail later, between 1907 and 1908, but we're going to concentrate on the Frankfort end tonight. Now, in Frankfort, there was a group of rail lines that came together, and as you can see on the map on the left of the screen, it was like a bowl of spaghetti to some degree, with all these different lines reaching into Frankfort and providing rail transportation. We're going to be talking about each individual line tonight, starting with the Philadelphia and Trenton, which opened in 1833. The program contents for tonight's presentation will cover the Philadelphia and Trenton Railroad, the Frankfort and Suffolk Railroad. I keep saying that because I come from London on vacation. It's Southwark in Philadelphia, Philadelphia and Frankfort Railroad, and then finally the Frankfort Elevated Planning and Components, its construction, and then a companion project, which is the Frankfort, Bustleton, Byberry, and Passenger Railway, which is a mouthful. We call it Route 59. And then finally, the opening celebration and service commencing. I will touch on the next 100 years, but we won't be able to cover that in its entirety this evening. So starting with the Philadelphia and Trenton Railroad in 1833, a railroad was built down to Kensington and was tried to extend that line as a horse car operation initially down into central Philadelphia. But within 2 years, they had converted to a steam locomotive operation. And once they started discussions about trying to get down city streets into central Philadelphia, opposition arose. So they were somewhat stymied, and they weren't able to get past the point of Front and Montgomery Streets down in Kensington. And on the north end, it initially ran as far as Bristol, then Morrisville, and then finally across the bridge on the Delaware River into Trenton. You can see here that they started out with horse cars, then quickly switched over to steam locomotives. Now, we don't normally see steam locomotives of this type today, but this is the early versions that were being built by Baldwin, a local locomotive manufacturer, and this was placed into service in 1835. I had this picture in my collection for 50 years, and I never knew where I was going to use it, and here it is showing up in this presentation tonight. So the Philadelphia and Trenton served Frankfort at the Frankfort station on Church Street. The image on the left, which is pretty early on, it might even be a Philadelphia and Trenton image, is a single platform and pretty early construction. On the right, you see in 1906, under the PRR management, Frankfort has really expanded. There's 2 buildings that have been built in the 1880s. There's extensive yards on both sides of the right-of-way for freight movement. So it's really grown very quickly. But down in Kensington, and attempting to go further south, they, as I said earlier, they were stymied, and they couldn't go past the point of Palmer Street. Originally, it was built as far as Montgomery Street, but then they acquired the whole area. There's like a 3-block long section of real estate, which I'll show you in a second. And then they built this large freight station. There was a lot of attempts to go past that point, but the neighborhood was very effective in describing their opposition by burning down the president of the railroad's building. So he got the point, we're not going any further. The building on the right is a passenger station that was built at the time that the termination was made effective permanently. Termination at Front and Montgomery Streets or Palmer Streets. This is a map which, thanks to Fred Moore, he suggested I insert some maps so that you're better oriented. Thank you, Fred. You can see that Norris Street's at the top of the box, Birch Street's in the middle, and that's where the Market Frankfort or the Frankfort Elevated Station is today. And then at the bottom is Palmer Streets. Now, that little P&R that's over on the left there, that's essentially where the North Penn Railroad Depot terminated. And they too found themselves stymied for running steam-powered passenger trains any further into town, and they had to transfer their passengers over to horse cars or some other form of transportation to get downtown. So how do we solve this problem? Well, the PRR acquired the Philadelphia and Trenton Railroad, and they were looking at solutions to getting Frankfort passengers downtown, but also to getting freight conveyed to the North Jersey market in New York, because at this point, the Pennsylvania Railroad only came into about 30th and Market Streets. They had to hand off the freight traffic for the North Jersey market to the Reading, which was blasphemy, but they didn't have a direct rail route. So they would transfer it to the Reading would carry it through Reading and up to Allentown for the Central Railroad of New Jersey. Then in 1881, the Pennsylvania Railroad finally entered Center City, Philadelphia by building a block-wide right-of-way down in between Filbert and Market Streets and ending at this grand structure built in 1881 called Broad Street Station. It's directly opposite City Hall. And I'll call your attention to another form of interesting public transportation that many people may not be aware of that Philadelphia had were cable cars. And if you look closely in front of the Broad Street Station, there is a cable car with a trailer passing in front of the building. Now, another development on rail transportation was a solution to running rail vehicles on city streets, not using steam engines. So a local inventor, I believe, was credited with building the first horse car in Frankfort. So you can see here, this is a horse car coming out of the barn at 5th and Jackson Streets. And that ran from 3rd and Berks down into Philadelphia, down to 5th and Morris. But they also extended northward into Frankfort and up Frankfort Avenue. So we had horse car service riding on rails as early as 1858, and they came as far as Frankfort and Arrett. They quickly switched over to, as a typical horse car, they quickly switched over to steam power, and they experimented with steam power from 1860 to 1863. And then another individual was credited, and his name escapes me at this very moment, but he was credited with encasing a steam engine into a streetcar type body to allay the fears of the horses, because the horses weren't really receptive to active steam engines running down the center street and spewing smoke and steam. So they encased the steam engine in this car body, and it became a very successful mode of transportation. Philadelphia was one of the most successful applications of this technology, and it essentially ran for 31 years. So a lot of people, I never realized that it lasted that long. It was very successful. Now, the horse cars that were built originally by Thomas Castor were also used as trailers towed by the steam dummies. And if you look at the upper deck seating there, it looks like bleachers on top of the second car there. And I'm sure that was overflow seating because you'd be dodging the smoke and coming out of the exhaust of the steam engine. Now, these cars, after 31 years, were not retired. They were sold. And they went to the Delaware Water Gap, and they went to Delaware County, and other operations that really wanted something that was low cost and didn't involve the infrastructure cost to build substations for electric power, overhead trolley lines. So they lived on in another life, in another application. There were depots built to support the horse car operation initially at Frankfort and Arrett in 1858. And you can see that building on the left here. By this time, it's also being used to support steam dummy operations. But this line was so successful that they actually cobbled together the financing to build this iconic dummy depot right on Oxford Street at Frankfort Avenue. And I love the architecture of this. And I know, John, I don't know where you are now, but I know you were researching whether or not this was designed by Frank Furnace, but it certainly does have some aspects of that. I love the Witch's Hat clock tower. It's great. So here's where that dummy depot would be located on Oxford Avenue, just at Frankfort. The dark line is Frankfort Avenue. So what spelled the demise of the steam dummy? Well, the first electric trolley enters Frankfort in 1894. So you can see that the first car, everybody had to ride the first car because I don't see any space on that car where anybody else could have gotten on it. But I'll allude to that picture again. But that was revolutionary, and it had gone into service in 1892 in other places in the city, But since the steam dummy operation was so well organized and running effectively, they deferred putting electric trolleys in Frankfurt until 1894. By 1896, we find that the electric trolleys are now extended all the way up to Bridge Street. And this is an interesting development because at first they went to Harrison Street, and then they wanted to go to Bridge Street. But the city of Philadelphia said, well, not so fast. We want you to pay for the paving of Frankfurt Avenue if you're going to go all the way to Bridge Street. And so there's some discussion between the operating company and the city of Philadelphia, and the operating company effectively acquiesced and did the road improvements, and finally trolleys reached Bridge Street. Also at Bridge Street, on the other side, was another company that started service northward up Frankfurt Avenue to the Bucks County line. That was the main route that they operated, and that was called the Holmesburg, Tacony, and Frankfurt City Railway Company. Well, that was a mouthful. So the local residents said, hey, why don't we just call it the Hop, Toad, and Frog? And that really stuck. The second route ran from Bridge Street and Frankfurt Avenue down Bridge Street to Tacony Street, State Road, and then up to Ron Street, made a left turn and went back up to Frankfurt Avenue. Now, that was all single track, but they had to enable to run frequent service, they had to put in 13 passing sidings. And the unusual part about the passing sidings were they were Y switches, not right-hand turnouts, not left-hand turnouts, but Y switches. So the speed through the turnouts could be kept at a higher level than a straight diversion route. For you railroaders out there. So the Hop, Toad, and Frog, they operated those two routes, but you know what they also wanted to do? They wanted to operate a route up to Bustleton, and they had grand plans to do that, but financially they fell on hard times. By 1910, they had to be reorganized, and of course they renamed it, so then it became the Frankfurt, Tacony, and Holmesburg, just to keep things confusing. Everybody still called it the Hop, Toad, and Frog. So here we see car 102 on the Ron Street route, and the date is interesting, 1924. So the L's been open 2 years, and this independent operation has continued. It will be taken over eventually by the PRT in 1926. The picture on the bottom is a mystery for those of you that are familiar with this. It's a rather large car. It's a builder's photograph at the J.G. Brill plant in Southwest Philadelphia. But I've looked and searched for rosters of this car, showing this car on the roster, and it just, all the cars with that number are much smaller. So I don't know if this car ever operated on the Frankfurt, Tacony, and Holmesburg, but there's the lettering. So now we're going to step into another form of transportation, which is railroad again. So we had the Philadelphia and Trenton. Now we're going to talk about the Philadelphia and Frankfurt Railroad. And this was a little different because the local businesses got together and financed the construction of a 2.6 mile long branch to connect with the Philadelphia, Newtown, and New York. I don't know if anybody's ever heard of that railroad, but it's very famous. Fred certainly knows it. They connected in Crescentville, and it was a nice short branch, but it was all grade separated. So they built a number of bridges over all the streets in Frankfurt and Northwood, and connected with the Philadelphia, Germantown, and Philadelphia, Newtown, and New York. And then finally, they were able to get all the way downtown and arrive at Reading Terminal in 12th and Market. They built this beautiful station. This one was attributed to Frank Furness, and it had a 3-track terminal on the upper level. And the interesting part about this, as opposed to going to a station, waiting for a train, and then finding a seat on the train that's been started somewhere else, people would come to this station and a train would be waiting for them. So there's a whole different experience. And now the way the station was designed, it was sunlit with a cathedral ceiling. It was a whole different travel experience. And it was elevated. It was elevated out of Frankfurt, and it was elevated approaching Reading Terminal. So remember that electric trolley car? Well, there's the Frankfurt Depot in the background, looming in the background. So both of these things were happening at the same time. This is about where that station would be located today. It's a PGW office today. You would hardly know that there was a grand structure like that in existence at that location. It's unfortunate. I think it was torn down. It was closed in 1928 and torn down by 1939, I believe. Philadelphia and Frankfort also had a smaller station at Arrett Street. The service started on July 2nd. The first train arrived, and that was a great picture. I should have called that out. That picture in the Frankfort collection is just amazing. The resolution is phenomenal, and I just love it. I've always been a fan of the Frankfort branch, as if you don't know by now. We talked about the elevated right-of-way. The things that were new were 30-minute service to Center City, so it took 30 minutes to get down to 12th and Market, and the trains ran every half hour. So that's rather an aggressive frequency of service for a railroad in this time period. So they really tried to offer a competitive service, although it was hard to compete with the fares of the streetcar. So the railroad fares were a little higher. Now, we talked about joining up with the Philadelphia, Newtown, and New York, and lo and behold, what did they call it? Frankfort Junction. It's nowhere near Frankfort, it's in Crescentville, but yes, there's a second Frankfort Junction tower located in Crescentville. And then the service went all the way down into Reading Terminal, as we talked about, on an elevated right-of-way, which was grand because this terminal consolidated a number of remote terminals, including the one we talked about at 3rd and Burke Street. All those trains could now come into this 13-track facility, which opened in 1893. Now, why are we all here? We wanted to learn more about the rapid transit in Frankfort. So rapid transit comes to Philadelphia finally. In 1901, franchises were issued by the Philadelphia for several routes. The Market Street franchise, which was the first one built, was acquired by the Union Traction Company. In 1902, the Market Street franchise was taken over by the Philadelphia Rapid Transit Company, which was formed out of the consolidation of many traction companies to build rapid transit branches. They acquired all the franchises initially, but they started work on the first one, which is the Market Street line. Now, there was a caveat to them getting this franchise, and that was that there would be no elevated over Market Street in downtown Philadelphia. So that was like, okay. So now they had to build a 4-track tunnel, at least initially from the Schuylkill River into 15th Street. And they also had to build a subway through the rest of Market Street out down to Front Street. So with all this work that's undertaken by the PRTC, they started to realize they really took on much more than they could afford. And at that point, the city officials were starting to get worried. The franchises that were held by the PRTC were surrendered back to Philadelphia, except for the Frankfort Elevated. And then one thing that came out of all that was that the future rapid transit lines could only be financed by the city. The private industry was not capable of doing it. So here we go. We're working on Frankfort Elevated planning. This poor guy is working on a 2-story map. The map was an indication of the proposed routes that came out of a Philadelphia Rapid Transit Commission report. And this 2-story map, we don't know exactly where it's been located, where it was located. Some people have said Wanamaker's, but I think it's a little too narrow to be there. But if anybody has any clue, I'm all ears. And of course, you can see that the map reflects that a rapid transit line to Frankfort is part of the proposal. So before long-lasting LED bulbs, there's the guy changing the bulbs on the map. So what components were in the project? Well, it was a 6.39-mile-long 2-track elevated with a possible extension to Ron Street? Yes, Ron Street. There were 12 stations with adjacent head house buildings. That was different from the Market Street elevated because the city specified that these buildings be the welcoming point to customers coming to ride the elevated. So there were different buildings for each station and all had architectural treatment so you could differentiate between them, and they were quite attractive. There were three large trestles to cross two railroads in Lehigh Avenue, and we'll get into that in a second. 100 new cars were purchased from the Brill Company, and a storage yard. You buy 100 cars, you need a storage yard, and an inspection building was placed in Bridge Street. And one thing that was unique about Frankfort was the business owners along Frankfort Avenue requested strenuously that the elevated be built on a single column bent structure in Frankfort. And what did that do? Well, that freed up the curb line, because the curbs in Frankfort were rather narrow. So it freed up the curbs for the merchants to have non-obstruction on the curb line in front of their stores. And finally, there were three substations. You have to power the trains. There were three substations included. Yes, Rowan Street. So there was a proposed extension to go to Rowan Street. There were stations at Conway, Levick, Tyson, and Cotman Avenue, and finally Rowan Street proposed as part of that extension. We all know that that was never built. The head houses we talked about, here's one at Allegheny, and you can see the treatment on the side of the building. And the other feature of it is these large glass panels which emitted light into the interior of these buildings. So you always got the feeling that you weren't in a subway, you were actually in a very well-lit environment, safe, well-lit, and convenient. You can see the architectural detail that they went into for each individual station. This one in particular is Allegheny. So inside, you can see the staircases were set up to facilitate rapid movement of passengers going up and down simultaneously. And then another example of a head house is the one that still exists today up at Bridge Street. It was retained by the Frankfort Transportation Center project and rehabilitated. And this also housed the motorman conductor quarters for the transportation department. Other elements of the station design are the canopies, steel canopies, protect the passengers while they're waiting for trains. That was a common feature along most of the stations. They were all lateral platform stations. What does that mean? That means they were on the side of the tracks, except for Bridge Pratt. And then I mentioned the large glass panels. This one, if anybody can confirm this, but my suspicion is that this is really coming down to the Frankfort Avenue and Arrett and Margaret intersection. And you can see there's a newsstand inside the building, and passengers can obviously get served at that particular newsstand, or pedestrians. So it's sort of a very vibrant environment. I mentioned the three trestles. There were two large bridges required to get over railroads, and then there was a third at Lehigh Avenue. And that one in particular goes to traction. There were two routes that ran down Kensington Avenue and turned right on Lehigh Avenue. Well, with the streetcars occupying the center of the track, there was no space to land a column in the middle of that large span. So they went to a bridge-type structure which stretched 112 feet long, and that was the third bridge. The other two bridges were over railroads, as I mentioned. The one on the right is over the Reading's Richmond branch, which was 10 tracks wide at that point. There was a lot of coal traffic that came down from upstate Pennsylvania, and the elevator had to bridge all 10 tracks in order to get down Kensington Avenue. The final one is located at Frankfort Junction, and if you peer closely at that picture, you'll see a switch tower there, and that switch tower at Frankfort Junction is called Shore. Now, why would it be called Shore? Because it controlled the movement of trains to the Delaware Bridge, would cross the river, Delaware River at this point, and went to all the shore points. At least that's my recommendation or my understanding, Vince. So we talk about cars. There were 100 cars bought, state-of-the-art, from the local car builder, J.G. Brill. They sat 51 passengers. They were accommodating a maximum number of standees. This car has longitudinal seating, was unusual for, God bless you, for non-crosswise seating, but the Frankfort elevator was designed to maximize standees. They had door edge safety retraction, so when the doors were closing, They would meet an obstruction and then quickly back away and then resume closing feature. And they also had ventilation. Now, we all know about the 1960 bug cars with the fans blowing on us in the summer. Well, they wanted to put that feature in these cars, and they made accommodation for it in 1922, but it was never installed. So let's talk about the construction of the elevated. So in 1915, work started on foundation work, and they had to sink pilings down to reach bedrock in the areas where there were poor soil conditions, and that was around Willow Street and around Callahill Street. So once that work was completed, they started constructing the elevated section, and here we are seeing the first one being built on the left here at Front and Callahill Streets in May 2nd of 1916. On the right, you see that the construction is progressing. We have an event number 72. So the first question that comes up in people's minds, what's a bent? So if you look at the picture on the left, that's a bent. It's two columns joined by a cross member. So you have two bents, and you would put a longitudinal track section between the two bents, and that's how you would construct the elevated going northward. And the bents are numbered northward, where they by the time they get to Bridge Street, they're in the 300s. We see some more work on the elevated down in that area. You can see that there a railroad is operating underneath the elevated, which was rather opportune because they could bring these large fabricated steel structures for the elevated right to the construction project. But they also had to build the elevated over an active freight railroad. And why was this freight railroad here? Well, one of the major customers was Schmidt's Brewery at 2nd and Girard. Here for Schmidt's. On the right is Bent 99 now, so we're working northward at Laurel Street, and that church is the Immaculate Roman Catholic Church. I know that's a question that I've been asked before. So the work is progressing. Now we're up to where the Philadelphia and Trenton had ended its service at Front and Palmer Streets. You can see the freight station is there on the left-hand picture, and we're working past it. On the right-hand picture, the left-hand picture, we're looking north. On the right-hand picture, we're now looking south, and there's the 1882 passenger station that was built for the Philadelphia and Trenton Riders. Now, the interesting part about that is that the Frankford elevated wasn't the first elevated railway at this location. The first elevated railway was the Philadelphia and Trenton, and it was elevated between Lehigh Avenue and this point in its termination. That elevated opened in 1910, and passenger service, yes, did operate over that elevated up until 1918. So you can see how bad things were because they ended the service in 1918, 4 years before the elevated opened. I mean, how fast did that have to happen? There was some construction negotiation necessary in this area in order to establish the Burt Street Station. The Philadelphia Rapid Transit Company, the City of Philadelphia at this point, had to negotiate with the PRR to build one of those separate head house buildings on their property. And again, just to remind you where this is all occurring, it's between Norris Street and Palmer Street on Front Street there. So now we got the bridges. This is at Lehigh Avenue, and here's the culprit that required the Lehigh Avenue Bridge to be built. It's a number 4 car coming down Kensington Avenue and turning right onto Lehigh Avenue, and that's on the left. On the right, we see the Reading Bridge finally being constructed, and that large building is a YMCA for engineers and train crew personnel to lay over and rest before their trip. After coming down from upstate Pennsylvania with a coal train, they would take empties back upstate for you engineers in the audience. So here's a map that kind of shows that area. You see that the railroad is there. It's not what it once was. It's not 10 tracks anymore. In fact, there's some residential developments occurring in this area, which is quite surprising. But this is exactly where those two bridges were located and are located. So now we've finally reached Frankford. And you can see on the left, there's an alignment looking southward down from Church Street towards the Erie-Tarsdale stop. On the right that's what a single column bent looks like. There's a Route 4 car again. Thank you, Susan. And it's coming up Frankfort Avenue, right around Dyer Street. And it's about to go into the Frankfort Depot. The construction progressed up to Arrett Street, and there's the dummy depot. Remember that? We saw that earlier. What you see on the left here are openings where a large girder had to be installed underneath the single column bank construction to stabilize it. So there was almost as much steel buried underneath the street as above the street in order to make that single column bank structure work. When you locate that in the middle of the street, it forces you to move the trolley tracks out towards the curb line. And I can't imagine what a juggling act that must have been while the construction was going on. That was the main method of traveling down through this area on trolleys. Now we've reached Bridge Street. You can see there's a 68-ton girder that's about to be raised onto columns. And this is the type of construction that was necessary to facilitate a future extension of Ron Street. So that's why these large girders were placed there, so that eventually when Ron Street was going to be built, they could just continue right up Frankfort Avenue. The Transportation Department building that was built in 1904 in front of the trolley depot, because again, before the elevator was built, all the transportation in this area was trolleys. That was retained after the elevator construction as shown in this picture. The one thing that happened that delayed the Frankfort elevated opening was there was an agreement that was necessary between the PRTC and the City of Philadelphia. The City of Philadelphia had built the elevated, and the PRTC was intended to be the operator, but the experience that the PRTC had with operating their Market Street elevated line gave them a pause about assuming certain financial responsibility. So there was a lot of discussion going on, and this was one of the last pieces of the Frankfort elevated that was constructed. You can see that the L on the left stops short of connecting, and there's a row of buildings that would have to be acquired and demolished before the connection could be made. As this dragged on, the City of Philadelphia started looking at options, and they actually considered running down independent of the Market Street line and then down Arch Street to reach Center City. But, all things take time, and finally the agreement was secured, and by October 21st, 1921, you can see work is commencing on the interlocking and junction. The component piece of the project was the Frankfort, Bustleton, and Byberry Surface Passenger Railway. That is a mouthful. We call it 59 today, but that was to be constructed as a parallel project as a 2-track trolley line, and it was to be built in 2 segments. What's interesting is the Byberry part. They actually put Byberry on the letterboard, so they were serious about going there. But they broke it into because of limited funding. Essentially what had happened is the delays that occurred in the construction of the elevated during the World War contributed to not only increasing the cost to construct the elevated, but also the delay in the supply of steel. And of course, we talked about the operating agreement. Well, the same thing, shortage of funding applied here as well. They only built the first segment of the proposed trolley, and it ended at Bustleton and Lott Street. And they bought 5 of these smaller cars that only sat 33 people, and it was soon to be found insufficient to carry the ridership. But be that as it may, on opening day, we arrived in Bustleton. The photo on the left appears to be a group of motormen, which is unusual, but it could have been a training run because these were a one-man operation where the operator collected the fares and drove the trolley. Now, before the trolley got to Bustleton, the railroads were there. The first railroad was the Philadelphia and Trenton. We know about that. That got there in 1870 and then was taken over by the Pennsylvania Railroad. The Reading came later when they built their New York Short Line. That opened in 1906, and they built a brand new station right on Welsh Road. to serve Bustleton. The trolley came up right in between the middle of them. The two stations, one was a converted residence that existed in Bustleton prior to the railroad arriving. And then, of course, on the left, you see the brand new station that was built in 1906. The Philadelphia and Trenton, or the PRR, quickly suspended service 4 years after the trolley started running. So that didn't last very long. But the Reading continued on until 1933. And just at that point, they had opened up all the electrified suburban services that they were working on since 1931. And they were able to offer frequent service from a nearby station at Beth Ayres. And then they closed the station at Bustleton. In order to reach Bustleton, there was a lot of discussion going back and forth about how the trolley line was going to reach Bustleton, because there was an old road bridge for Bustleton Pike, but it wouldn't be strong enough to support the trolley operation. The approaches were very steep. So instead of trying to get the Bustleton Road improvements done at the same time, they just built this temporary trestle. It was temporary in 1922, and it kept going until 1938. And then finally, they said, we got to do something about this temporary trestle. So they had to reinforce it for a number of reasons. One, it probably wasn't built to last that long. And second, you can see on the right, they're starting to use heavier cars to serve the ridership that's grown since 1922. Now, we've come all this way. The Frankford Elevated is completed. The Bustleton line's open and running, or just about. We're just on the cusp of that. Now it's time to party. So here we are starting a celebration in Frankfurt that lasted a whole week. This is the day before the opening. And you can see the more well-to-do town folk came out in their horse-drawn carriage and with their top hats. And then the rest of the people came out and got their photo taken. And it certainly appears that hats were not optional in this particular photograph, because everybody has one. There was also a restored horse car that was found somewhere, and they fixed it up and put it in the parade, and it operated up Frankfurt Avenue on the trolley tracks. And you remember that 68-ton beam that we were looking at Bridge Street? Well, now it's serving as a podium, and all the company officials and the Mayor Moore is giving speeches that day, all to celebrate the completion of the project and all the disruption ending. And finally, are going to throw the switch and the cars will be placed into service. Also, during that week of celebrations, a Bernie car was located on Oxford Street for passengers inspection, and a bronze plaque was also mounted in the Hammonds building at Bridge Street. And we don't know where that plaque is today. We know it was available for viewing before the Frankfurt Transportation Center project, but there's some mystery as to where it might be located today. The Bridge Pratt station was unique in that it was an island design. What did that do? Well, that allowed trains to arrive and leave from the same platform and minimize turn times. That was the only island platform on the line when it was constructed. And you can see now that the cars are ready. They're all prepped to receive passengers. Now, what happened at Bridge Street? My God, look at the change here. In 1918, it was all trolleys, and it was just, that was it. And then by 1922, you see the elevated's been built, the trackage around the facility's been realigned, and there's, what is that? It's a Hog Island car, and that's an unusual car to see up in this area. But we think that it brought some of the company officials up to the opening day ceremonies for the speeches. So we've made it all this way from 1833 to 1922. And at this point, I have to say that I think we've covered a lot of ground, and I was going to go further and talk about the 100 years of the Frankfurt Elevated, but I think we're going to save that for another program. But I'll just put up a couple of important dates that were indicating the major improvements or changes to the Frankfurt Elevated. And some of them you see that stand out: the creation of PTC, the Bud-built Frankfurt cars that came, Young and Joy cars, as some of us refer to, in 1960. Some other dates, the creation of SEPTA, the Frankfurt Elevated Reconstruction Project, and finally in 2022, where we are today, Frankfurt Elevated and Route 59 celebrate 100 years of service. So now I just want to finish with a couple of then and now pictures so you can just see how far we've come. Sorry, there's a bug there. So here's Bustleton. You can see the trolley started with a little 33-passenger Bernie car, and now it's a modern trackless hybrid operation. What does hybrid mean? It means that it has a diesel engine in the back of the trolley bus, so that if the power is disrupted or there's a fire where you have to run off wire, you can keep maintaining your service, run around the fire, and put your poles back on the wires after you pass the blockage. The cars, well, look at the car change. The cars on the left have a unique feature. Are you ready for it? It's called air conditioning, first time ever introduced on the Frankfurt Elevated in 1999. What a change. And there were many other features that were in the car. So SEPTA finally took care of us with a new fleet of cars. Some things didn't change. The Tioga Head House, it certainly looks the same as it did back in 1922, but it's fabulously restored, and it's in full view in Harrogate Park. I fully encourage you not to go down there and take a picture of it. Finally, here's the Frankfurt Transportation Center. We're not going to Rowan Street, so they took the tracks and the platforms and they relocated them off of Frankfurt Avenue. You can see what Frankfurt Avenue was like before that project was finished. And now we have this beautiful transportation center to welcome riders to the Frankfurt Elevated. And finally, we reached the end of the line. Here's Dan Hammond's building. On the right is before it was restored, and it's still in use today. It's still used as the transportation building, and it's been fully restored as part of that project. So we made it. I want to thank you all very much for your patience tonight and joining us in this journey. And the last thing I want to say is that if you're interested in more information about this project and all the services that were offered in Frankfurt, we have a book available for sale at the table right where Bruce is sitting. So thank you very much. Is there John, you threw me off with the clock thing because it didn't start at the right time. But anyway, is there any questions? Yes?
The center fence went from Church to Dyer.
Except for the Mark-Around Orthodox station. Yeah, there were double columns necessary to support the platforms there.
You mentioned that they had to bring the trolley lines over to the side.
The trolley tracks had to be spread apart for the single column fence to be located in the center of the streets.
Did they do that all the way from Church?
Church all the way up to
Dyer,
up to Dyer Street.
like a couple of weeks?
No, it doesn't work that way. It takes a lot of time. They probably ran short stretches of single track. They would relocate one track while everything was using the other track. Yes?
Have you talked to or made back to presenting to SEPTA with this information? This could be like useful, like have a like thing started to book down at the main station at 13th Street, or have some other display about this section of the line.
The book will be for sale eventually in the museum store down at 12th and Market. And yes, I have been in direct communications with them. They were very helpful in the preparation of the book and this presentation tonight.
How about the terminal when it came to Bridge Street, circled around, right? And out the other side?
Yes, there was a loop on the other side of Bridge Street for trains to continue around, and you kept the motorman's cab in service. There were different ways you can do it. It depends on the scheduling. Coming from the SEPTA scheduling department, at certain points of the day, you would have trains arriving so quickly that you couldn't turn on the platform and go back out again because you would be stacking up trains trying to get into the platform. So some of the trips would go around the loop, which would clear the platform, and then a train could come behind it, turn and go out, and then another one would go through to the loop. So the loop allowed trains to go through to the service building, but it also helped scheduling at the platform. And one of the things that I may not have touched on in here, but I've touched on it in the book, is in 1952, they had to build another platform at Bridge Street in order to speed the movement of passengers. And it's a unique design because it's a lateral platform. You had an island platform adjacent to the track on the one side, and then a lateral platform on the other side. Basically, trains would come in, discharge to the right, open the doors on the left, people would board, and the train could go. You'd have a different motorman in each end. One motorman would get out of one end of the train, and a new motorman would get in on the opposite end of the train, close the doors, and go.
I didn't mention to you that we don't have audio out there, so you may want to repeat any questions that you get from the audience.
Sure, I'm sorry.
If it's not
Yes.
audible enough.
Thank you, John.
There was a design flaw in the center girder of the Frankfurt elevator. The concrete came right up to the center girder between the two tracks, and it led to major deterioration and rusting. And it led to what they call the Frankfurt L scandal, where it was supposed to be repaired, but there were all types of kickbacks when NCL took over in the 50s. And it wasn't until sometime in the mid-70s that problem was finally remedied, where they had to jackhammer out the concrete and replace certain numbers of that center girder that traveled.
So, John, would you like to repeat that?
I think that was a bit much. He was pretty audible, actually.
Okay, thank you.
So, by chance, would there ever come a situation where the conductor had to go to the bathroom? Only stop at a station and
En route? No, I mean, the total travel time wasn't that long. Ed, how long would you say the travel time is from one end of the line to the other?
excuse me?
What is the travel time on the Market Frankfurt line today from one end to the other?
It's probably about an hour to round up, but the operators drop a trip when they reach the end of the line.
Right, so
They all fall back on trip.
right, so they would always,
They have their lunch breaks, which are guaranteed at 17 and 20 minutes.
so they would operate the train from 69th Street to Frankfurt and then get relieved. They wouldn't be on the equipment. They would get relieved, a new motorman would get in, and they would have plenty of time to get a break for the bathroom. Yes, Alan?
Yeah, the running time from 69th Street to Frankfurt has varied. When they still had the original 1907 and 1922 cars, it was 43 minutes end to end. And before they had speed control or time signals installed, with the new blood cars, it was down to 36 minutes, but now it's somewhere between 38 and 40 minutes.
And it's probably a lot safer too.
38 to 40 minutes.
38 to 40 minutes was the travel time? Okay.
The rebuilding of the Market Street elevator has greatly slowed down the entire operation. The trains crawl in and out of 44th Street tunnel out, where they used to go much faster. And when they get midway between 52nd Street and 46th Street, they cut their speed in half coming into 46th Street Station. So this wonderful rebuilding of the west end, that ugly structure that they put up, has reduced the speed of the line greatly. And for some reason, it ran for almost 100 years before the new cars and the line was rebuilt in 2010 without a problem. But they just like drop anchor. And also, the design of the Frankfurt Transportation Center at street level is a total disaster as far as I'm concerned. You have people wandering all over the place. You have areas where you aren't supposed to walk, but people walk. The whole flow there, I think, is really terrible.
So noted, Ed. Yes?
Harry, did you ever find out how they got them first 100 cars here?
We have a mystery too, and Ed, maybe you can answer this question. Well, as I pointed out, the junction with the Market Street passenger elevator wasn't finished until 1921, probably later than that. And a number of cars showed up at the Bridge Street storage yard, and we're not sure how exactly they got there. The connection wasn't established yet. So how did the cars get from the Brill plant to the Bridge Street car storage yard without a connection?
I assume.
Like-
They could have run another service even if it's the same date. It had to be trucked somewhere.
So the-
69th Street probably, where we had that large open yard. where cars could
Right,
transfer.
they could have come on the railroad, on the Cardington branch to get to 69th Street, but that doesn't get them to Bridge Street. And we've gone back and forth with it. I've heard truck, and I've also heard that Brill might have had a flat car that they could have placed the cars onto, and then they towed that across the streetcar tracks to get them there as well. But it probably happened in the middle of the night, and no one was out there with flashes to take pictures of it and document it.
There was also for the I-95 replacement of that section of the elevator, when they built that very spindly,
Trestle.
barn structure, south of Gerard Avenue, when the L was relocated to the center of I-95. And also prior to the opening of the relocated structure, on one weekend, where the new tunnel met the old tunnel, they discontinued service to Frankfurt, and they put a temporary curve in with the existing track east of 2nd Street, and ran a 2-car train up onto the new structure and tested it for about a week, going back and forth. They restored the service on Monday, and then when it was time to bring the two 600 series cars back to 69th Street, they just shifted the track over again, and another weekend was lost for service in Frankfurt. That's
Wow.
when they restored the cars back to 69th Street.
I have a picture in the presentation in the second part that shows those two cars on the new right-of-way while a revenue train's crossing over top of it. And the picture was taken down from the Delaware River Bridge, or as we know it today, the Ben Franklin Bridge. Yes, Alan?
Yeah, a couple of things. When you talk about the, the speed on the line, they've been running the line without any real signaling control. And I've noticed that on the present and trans cars, they have slowed them down quite a bit at various points because they have, instead of having the original side of the original signals.
Wayside signals.
Yeah, the original traffic light type signals on the side, the color light signals, which were used to control the speed. They now do it electronically, and I think that it's really much slower. In fact, just from comparing, say, a train coming out of Frankfurt Terminal, heading towards 69th Street, I've noticed that the point where they can accelerate to full speed has been moved farther away from Bridge Street.
Right. So I think that's what Ed was referring to, is that the new signal system has really slowed trains down, but they're safer.
Well, for instance, coming out of Frankfurt Terminal, bud cars were allowed to accelerate the speed, say, in front of the Frankfurt Hospital parking garage. Now, the current trains aren't allowed to accelerate the speed until they get to the hospital itself, practically a lot farther down. And as far as I can remember with the L, as far as when the trains reach the end of the line at Frankfurt, I can't remember them ever running trains around the yard before they go out Yeah, I think during the off-peak hours, trains would come in and the motorman would take them, would just go to the other end of the train, and just take right out off the same track. However, during the rush hour, what they would do, there's a crossover track past the platform on the way to the yard. And there's that one crossover. In fact, I remember the PA system saying, train on track 2, crossover 13. And it would make the entrance to the yard, take this crossover, and then come back out on track 1. But as far as actually going deep into the yard and making a complete loop, I've never seen that done.
Okay, I stand corrected, but I do know that they would run them beyond the platform, across them over, and free the platform track up for a second train to come in and turn and go back out.
Yeah, that's what they do, that all the trains, we say, come in on track 2, take that crossover towards the yard, and then go back out on track 1.
One of the problems with both the Market Street elevated and the Frankfurt elevated, when they were rebuilt, they removed the ballast. So it's a much noisier structure now. I live 8/10 of a mile north of the Market Street elevated, and I can hear the trains rumbling. And at like 5 o'clock in the morning, I know when the key train is going out to open up the stations. So it's incredible that the sound, even sometimes in the middle of the day, is relatively quiet. You can hear the trains on Market Street.
Are you saying it's some kind of baffle or something, knock noise down?
What's that?
You're saying it's some kind of baffle or something sad, knock
It
noise
was
down?
ballast, it was stone,
Yeah,
and that kept the noise there.
I think that whole thing was a cost-cutting savings. It was a lot cheaper to build it the way they did now, and it's also less maintenance. But it's true, without that crushed stone ballast between the tracks, yeah, the noise is terrible.
We're going to call a wrap on this now. However, nobody's going to walk away. We're going to stay around. We're going to have refreshments, and we want everybody to have as much conversation as they want, although it won't be broadcast. And I've got some closing remarks.
Frankford's elevated railway and its predecessors is for sale. How much? $25. You can get an autographed copy if you're here tonight. And we will be able to put you in touch with a way to collect it in the future, should you wish to purchase it and not happen to be here or not happen to have $25 with you tonight.
It's available on the website.
It's also available, oh yeah, okay, good. It's available through our website. We will be back with something in December. We'll be back in March again, but we will be taking January and February off, and we look forward to having everybody stay in touch with us. And I hope you all stay well and come back. Thank you.